ready to get started again. For those who are watching online, we apologize for the little technical glitch that we had for a few minutes today. I'm Joe Graziano. I'm the director of the Superfund Research Program at Columbia University. And my great pleasure to introduce Tiffany Sanchez, who is right now a postdoctoral research scientist in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, working with Tiffany was my PhD student here, and before that, she did her undergraduate dissertation with me at Columbia. So she's been with us a long time, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks. I'm really excited to share some of the research I'm working on this past year. And I'll be talking about rice consumption patterns, low-level arsenic exposure, and chronic lung disease, studying this in the U.S. population. Let's see. This works.
Where's Nancy?
I know.
Enter.
Enter. Click on it and then try to.
Don't push it.
Okay. All right. It works. So as we just heard a wonderful talk about arsenic in drinking water, and hundreds of millions of people are exposed to arsenic through drinking naturally contaminated groundwater. And here I'm just showing a map of some of the arsenic-affected aquifers around the world. Now, arsenic is a major environmental contaminant, and it's recognized by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 chemicals of major public health concern. And that's in part because it's associated with several different adverse effects of several different organ systems, including the lung, which I'm interested in. So in 1980, IR classified arsenic from inhalation, via inhalation, as a lung carcinogen. But then in 2004, they further confirmed that arsenic exposure through drinking water is also a recognized human lung carcinogen. So this is really the first chemical that is known to cause lung cancer through two unrelated routes of exposure. I don't know. Fascinating. So ominous. But I'm also interested in the work that's looking at arsenic exposure and non-malignant lung disease, so chronic, non-cancerous. And so there's a growing body of epidemiologic research showing that arsenic exposure is also associated with various non-malignant respiratory outcomes, health endpoints. However, most of these studies have been looking at self-reported outcomes. But it gets more interesting because there are several hypothesized mechanisms. So the mechanisms here haven't been fully elucidated, but there's growing toxicological evidence. So one pathway that arsenic could affect the lungs is through an altered immune response. The immunosuppression could also lead to a chronic wound-healing environment, leading to aberrant wound repair, leading to this fibrotic-like disease. So you have extracellular matrix modeling that may change. Alternatively, we also see some evidence that arsenic could lead to an obstructive-like lung disease, and that could be through a depressed pathogen, clearance of pathogens. And this could be, arsenic could lead to the multi-ubiquitous inhalation of this protein CSTR, which actually helps remove mucus. And so you get rid of arsenic, degrades that protein, then you have this mucus build up in your lungs. So you could have this obstructive-like disease. So these are these two competing mechanisms resulting in these two different lung disease phenotypes. So my interest is really trying to understand, does the epidemiologic evidence support the toxicologic evidence? So I really want to understand what do our human studies say, and how does that relate to the animal and the tox research? So to look at this, we can use spirometry to really determine if it's more of a fibrotic-like response or an obstructive-like response. So here I'm showing you spirometry curves. This is time and volume, and this is how much air you can get out over time with a forced exhalation. So the dotted gray line, that's the predicted level, and the blue line is the observed value. So if we're in a restrictive-like spirometry pattern, you actually can't get as much air out. So your lungs actually can't expand and contract as much as a normal person's lungs. So you have a reduced overall volume of air that you can get out, as well as the amount of time, the amount of air you can get out in that first second. So that's reduced. But you have this normal ratio. And the ratio is actually important when you look at the other hand, the obstructive light spirometry. Here you can see you can get this whole amount of air out. This is similar to what we see in asthmatic patients. But really getting that air out that first second is much harder. So eventually you can breathe all the way out, but you have this obstructive light pattern, it's hard to get air out. And you have this reduced ratio. So these are sort of very clear, easy to use metrics to look at lung function in human population. So the first thing I did was to see what evidence is already out there and can we just figure out using the evidence available. So for this, I conducted a meta-analysis looking at the relationship between water arsenic exposure and lung function levels. So for this, we searched PubMed and NBase for studies on arsenic exposure and spirometry, lung function. We ended up with very few studies, 9 studies were included, and that's just because we excluded studies that weren't in humans, we excluded studies that didn't have lung function, spirometry measures, studies also that didn't have a marker of either water arsenic exposure or urinary arsenic exposure. So the studies sort of nicely overlap with where we see contaminated aquifers. We see 3 studies from Bangladesh, 2 from West Bengal, India, 1 from Pakistan, 1 from Mexico, and 2 from Chile. So of the studies included, the sample sizes range from 97 to almost 1,000. Overall, there are about 4,700 participants. Response rates were pretty good among those studies that were reported responses. And you see there's a pretty even mix between males and females of what they looked at, except for one study here that was all males. You see age range from 6 years old all the way up to 65, but not much older than that. And we also see most of the studies had a marker of water arsenic and just a few with urinary arsenic. So we know for meta-analyses, your results are only as good as the underlying data available. So here I'm showing you what data we had to work with. These are the 3 basic markers of lung function that I just explained, FEV1 and FEC. However, we see this clear evidence of reporting bias already. So only 3 of the studies actually reported the FEV1 to FEC ratio. And that's really important for either determining or saying it's not restrictive lung disease. So we see obvious evidence of reporting bias, right? One thing else to mention is that for lung function, it's a relatively effort-dependent test. So if you're really bad at a test, you're going to have bad results. So we have to follow these ATS guidelines and acceptability criteria. So most of the studies say that they use these ATS acceptability criteria to make sure that spirometry tests were standardized and that the results are valid. We also see that for PTS or pulmonary function test scoring, that not only did most of the studies use the software that comes along with the spirometry package to make sure that these are valid results, but they also had a clinician go over each of the spirograms and make sure that the tests were valid. So the data here is mostly good, but you do see some variation. And again, we also see all but one of the studies adjusted for age, sex, height, and smoking status. So it's pretty good. So when we meta-analyzed our study of all of the results using an inverse variance weighted random effects model, and we see a really nice association with increasing or with high level arsenic associations was associated with lower FEV1 and FEC. So this is associated with a restrictive like spirometry, which is adding evidence to sort of that one mechanism of action or one mechanism. However, I told you that only 3 studies actually reported the ratio of FEV1 to FEC, and of those that we see, it's essentially null. So I think people aren't actually reporting the results in their articles because the results are boring and null and non-significant and no one wants to report that in their journals. But it's also very important because we need to know if it's obstructive lung disease, and this is the marker you use to figure that out. So I also tried to make all these results go away. So I reviewed one study at a time to see if any one study had a significant effect. That didn't really change anything. Then I looked at just those studies that used urinary arsenic, and that didn't really change anything. Only those that used water arsenic, and that didn't change anything. So it was pretty robust in these sensitivity analyses. I also looked at subgroup differences. There's been some evidence of sex differences with arsenic exposure for outcomes, and here we didn't really see any significant differences between males and females, although it does maybe look like males have a slightly stronger effect in males. We looked at smoking status. Only again, 4 studies had presented results stratified by smoking status. We see no difference in smoking status. And then finally, this is age at spirometry. We see that adults actually have worse, or actually have stronger associations between arsenic and FEV1 than children did. So maybe this is evidence that chronic exposure is very important, or maybe looking at lung function in adulthood is actually better. That will actually tell you more information. So again, this is very small study sample, but. So I was also really interested in looking at the dose-response relationship between water, arsenic, and lung function. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough data to actually do a formal dose-response meta-analysis, but we did sort of group this into 3 different exposure levels: extremely high arsenic exposure, very high arsenic exposure, and high arsenic exposure. For everyone in the room who probably is well aware, all of these exposure levels are far beyond the WHO and EPA guideline and MCL values of 10 micrograms per liter. But we do see this dose-response relationship with higher arsenic exposure associated with much lower FEV1 and FEC. But this really brings us to the limitations of the available EPI research. So even the lowest exposure groups shown here are above the guideline levels for the World Health Organization and the EPA. And there really is no evidence from the US, and I'd like to change that. So just some key messages from the meta-analysis. We see that high-dose water arsenic exposure was associated with lower FEV1 and FEC levels. But we did see a lot of evidence of reporting bias. So very few studies reported the results for this ratio. And studies available were mostly at very high water arsenic levels that exceeded the WHO EPA consent level. And there was also very limited longitudinal analyses. So we're really interested in how lung function changes over time. Does your lung function get worse? And there were no studies that actually repeated lung function values. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when moving forward with research. And further, there is no epidemiologic evidence in the US. So this past year, I applied with Anna for a small pilot study fund from the Columbia P30 Center, the Center for Environmental Health in Northern Manhattan, in order to measure urinary arsenic in a US population, with the goal of trying to determine whether arsenic is associated with lung function, and specifically this innovative aspect, lung imaging markers here in the US. And I wanted to use the data that we generated from this pilot study to develop and submit a K99. So one of the limitations and one of the troubles with looking at arsenic exposure in the U.S. and arsenic exposure and health outcomes in the U.S. is that exposure estimates are complicated by food. In the U.S., where water arsenic exposure is very low, food is an important source of arsenic exposure. However, separating these toxic arsenicals from non-toxic arsenicals really gets complicated. So in water, we just heard that it's virtually all inorganic arsenic. However, when we look at rice, there's a mixture of the very toxic inorganic arsenic, the less toxic DMA. Apple juice also has this spattering. So if you're like me, you have a nice rice pilaf along with your fish fillet, you're not only getting your toxic arsenicals, but you're also getting overwhelmed by these non-toxic arsenobetanes and sugars and lipids. So these other non-toxic arsenical species. So we're really trying to separate the good and the bad, or not the good, the not bad and the very bad. So the traditional arsenic measurements here in the U.S. can be biased by these high levels of seafood arsenicals, these non-toxic arsenicals. So traditionally, we use the sum of inorganic arsenic, the sum of MMA, and the sum of DNA. These are our toxic arsenicals. And we try to say that this is sort of getting rid of that seafood part of it. But we see here that some of these sugars and the arsenolipids can actually further metabolize into actually leading to DMA. So this can be biased just using this traditional arsenic measurement. Some other studies have used total urinary arsenic minus and taking out arsenobetane. But again, you're left with these other arsenic sugars and lipids. So that can also bias your results. in these analyses. So Anna Malzapien and Miranda Jones, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, they borrowed a really great technique that's used in nutritional epidemiology called regression calibration. And they did this to remove the influence of non-toxic arsenicals while still retaining this important information on all these toxic species. So you simply just regress arsenobutane on each of your toxic arsenicals and take those residuals. And so in order to make it a easy to understand and easy to interpret model, you also take the mean levels of all the arsenicals from those people with very low levels of arsenobutane, so your non-seafood eaters, and then add a residual back to that. So it sounds a little complicated, but it's pretty straightforward, and you get this really nice, really easy to interpret calibrated arsenic biomarker. So this exposure method is really helping us to enable us to investigate low-level arsenic exposure and potential health consequences here in the U.S. And so this is what we're trying to use. This is Miranda Jones, the results from her pilot study. So I just want to show you this in action. So the pilot study, the population it's coming from is the same population that I'm going to be doing my pilot study on. But before I formally introduce it to you, I want to show you that this regression calibration works. So in the top, you see self-reported seafood intake increasing, and then you see the traditional sum of arsenic. And you see this significant association, which is not what we want to see. That means that our results are still influenced by our non-toxic arsenicals. However, when we look at our calibrated arsenical biomarker, that association goes away. So that's great. We remove the influence of the non-toxic arsenical species. And when we look at rice, which we know has those toxic arsenical species, inorganic arsenic and DMA, we see that the regression calibrated biomarker is still associated with frequency of self-reported rice intake. So we're getting rid of the bad and keeping, well, the very bad, but this is what the association we want to see. So Miranda and my pilot are both have both really used this incredible cohort study that's here in the U.S. called the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. So MESA was originally designed to look at progression of subclinical cardiovascular disease and what leads to it to become overt cardiovascular disease in a U.S. population, a diverse population. And it's actually great for our needs of looking at environmental exposures. It's a very large study with 6,000 adults from 6 different cities across the U.S. With 4 racial ethnic groups, including Blacks, Whites, Hispanics, and Asians. It's between 45 and 84 years of age, and there's a really rich source of data, outcome data available. And it's an ongoing data collection. So there's currently, I think, starting up exam 6, and they also have stored biospecimens, which it's been magical to work with. So the study began in the year 2000, which they collected urine and also performed a chest CT. And this is where Miranda used what she used for a pilot study with 310 participants. For my pilot, we also looked at MESA urine from exam 5. What's also great is that there's a full lung CT that happened at exam 5, and as well as half the participants actually also got a lung function test performed between exam 3 and 4 and at exam 5. So we have all these great, nice measurements of exposure and outcome at different times. So first we wanted to see if our 2 measures of urinary arsenic were associated with one another and how that changes over time. This is a very low level of arsenic exposure in the US, and this is one of, it's a great way to see how it changes. So first we just looked at the Spearman correlation of exam 1 versus exam 5, and you see a significant correlation between exam 1 and exam 5 urinary arsenic of 0.043. And then when we looked at the interclass correlation coefficient, you saw that there's actually moderate variation over time. So this means that there is a little more variance within compared to between. So between participants, the variation was less than within participants over time. So this was slightly unexpected. But when we looked at a paired t-test to see if those differences were actually significant, they weren't. So perhaps one single measure of urinary arsenic might not fully reflect long-term low-level arsenic exposure, but it does still provide us a great deal of information. So 2 would be better than 1, but 1 is still great. So now I just want to walk through the participants for a pilot study by increasing urinary arsenic tertile. We see BMI was slightly lower for those in the higher arsenic tertile. Also see a predominant amount of Asians in the highest tertile of arsenic exposure. We also see that they were mostly from LA, and that has to do with where Asians were mostly recruited from, what city they lived in. And tertile 3, ever smokers were non-significantly less likely to be in tertile 3. So in our cross-section analyses, we saw this inconsistent association. So if we look at exam 1 urinary arsenic and exam 3-4, the pulmonary function test there, the first one, we see this really nice inverse association. It's non-significant, but it's a really nice direction. But then when we look at exam 5, it sort of goes away. And this might be because the sample size is decreased, but we really didn't know what to make of that. But then I presented this last week and I got a lot of great feedback. And one of the feedback was you should just do longitudinal analysis, just, do GE. So when we looked at that, we used the GE to estimate our coefficient estimates. And we saw this, again, non-significant, but a decrease in FEV1 and FVC. So I want to stress again that these are just preliminary results. These are very new, and I still need to do a lot of work to make sure this is okay. But this is what we looked at so far. And over here on the right, I'm just showing mean levels before and after and sort of stop plots here. And you can see maybe slightly small decreases, but the confidence intervals right there too. So I was also really interested in MESA because they have this rich data set of CT scans and they have quantitative CT measurements. And this could, I thought, really also add to the literature on arsenic and chronic lung disease. So I consulted with a pulmonologist and asked which sort of outcomes I should look at. And they told me to look at 2 really, high attenuation areas and low attenuation areas, or emphysema-like lung. So percent high attenuation area is a subclinical marker of interstitial lung disease, of fibrotic lung disease. And a lot of this work on this biomarker has actually been done in the MESA cohort. And they've seen that a high attenuation area was associated with biomarkers of inflammation, biomarkers of extracellular matrix remodeling, lower FEC levels, and higher odds of interstitial lung abnormalities. So it's a really nice quantitative marker of interstitial lung disease. Alternatively, we can use low attenuation areas or percent emphysema to look at a marker of obstructive lung disease. So percent emphysema on CT, you can see it up here, correlates with COPD progression, independent of lung function. Also, if you look at percent emphysema on a scan and then look at actual lungs post-mortem, you see a strong association too. So this is also that's a nice marker of obstructive lung disease as well. So this is just looking at the correlations between spirometry and CT values in our study. You see again, as I just mentioned, that there's a negative association between FVC and high attenuation areas, so that's our restrictive like. And then for percent emphysema or obstructive like, again, we see it with FVC to the ratio. So this is sort of just saying that what I just told you was actually true in our study population. So now when we're looking at our CT markers, again, these are cross-sectional associations. There wasn't a real consistent association. Again, we see stronger evidence at exam 1 cross-sectionally for our high attenuation areas. And so it's borderline specific here, but then this is attenuated at exam 5. And with emphysema, we don't see really anything here. Again, this is similar to our results for lung function findings, but it's a very small sample size. So again, our preliminary longitude analysis, we see a marginally significant, although attenuated effect for the geometric mean ratio of urinary arsenic and percent high attenuation area. So the summary of the pilot study was I was a little disappointed about it, but you really shouldn't be because the sample size is so small. We found modest associations between urinary arsenic and lung function, and we really think that the differences in urinary arsenic over time might help explain why we saw these inconsistent results between our exams, between those cross-sectional analyses. Perhaps the exam 5, since this was 10 years later, these adults are getting much older now, they perhaps are influenced by a small sample size and potentially a survivor bias. But we did see that the direction of association between our urinary arsenic and our CT markers was consistent with our lung function findings. So it makes sense in the big scheme of things, it just wasn't significant. So then this pushed us into a new area of research. We had a small sample size with urinary arsenic, but what we're really getting at is rice. We wanted to know what's going on with rice consumption. I have celiac disease, I eat a lot of rice, I want to know, am I going to have problems with my health later in life, of course. But so this is a growing field of research, and there have been a few studies that looked at 2 different outcomes. So one study, actually from the HEALS cohort in Bangladesh, looked at rice consumption levels and prevalence of skin lesions among those who were exposed to very low levels of water arsenic. And they saw increasing odds of skin lesions with higher rice consumption levels. And the same thing goes with a skin cancer study here in the US, which is hot off the presses, looking at increased rice consumption levels and odds of skin cancer. Alternatively, we had really mixed findings with cardiovascular disease. There's one study in Japan that saw decreased, if any, protective effects between rice consumption patterns and cardiovascular disease mortality. And then in the US, looking at the nurses' health study, there was a pooled cohort there. They saw no association between rice consumption patterns and CVD risk, and it is mostly in a white population. So my question is, well, what about the lungs? Do I have to worry? So we decided to use rice as a proxy for arsenic exposure in our population. And you see here, it really nicely, they do percentages of those with urinary arsenic. Those who had 1 or more servings of rice per day were more likely to be in the 3rd highest urinary arsenic tertile than in the lowest tertile. And so it shows us that rice is a nice proxy for arsenic exposure in this population. So this allowed us to look at the full sample size of MESA, so really expand it to those with all lung function and CT scans and those who had the food frequency questionnaire complete. So we saw about 9% of the population, actually of the study population, ate 1 or more servings of rice per day. They were more likely to be male, also had a lower BMI. Again, they were predominantly Asian and predominantly living in Los Angeles. And they were less likely to be ever smokers. So they're mostly more likely to be non-smokers. Here, I'll leave this. Oh, I don't even know how to go back. I'm not going to. Backspace. Didn't work. Nope. Okay, there. Right through. So I talked earlier in our pilot study how exam 5 was really weird, and we had these attenuations and sort of null effects. So here I'm showing you the results from exam 5, but exam 1 was also very similar. And in our cross-sectional analyses here with a much larger sample size, we see this actual consistent inverse association between rice consumption and lung function. So this, if you're eating 1 or more servings a day versus eating no servings a day, the mean difference in lung function is pretty large, both for FEV1 and for FEC. And then when we looked at our preliminary longitudinal analysis, so we had rice at exam 1 and exam 5 as well, we see again an inverse association, and this is significant for those who consume 1 or more servings of rice per day versus those who rarely ate rice. So here I'm just showing the preliminary longitudinal analysis for rice consumption and our CT markers. And again, we see it's significant and associated with this high attenuation area. So indicating that it is associated with a fibrotic-like disease. 1 or more per day here, and then it goes down.
Can I ask you a question? What proportion of your Asian population do you think eats basmati rice, which is very low in arsenic?
The majority of the population in Mesa who are Asian are actually Chinese Americans.
So they would not necessarily.
They're not necessarily, yeah. But I don't know what the different rice varieties would be.
I mean, it's really striking. That's why the difference.
Iranian Americans, they're also classified the same way. It's a big group in LA.
And they would eat
as a rice
basmati.
eating community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it might be worth, you might strengthen your results if you split those out.
You cannot.
We don't have the data. We don't have
Type of rice.
type of rice.
No, but
So all Chinese Americans, all of them.
Yeah. So just some takeaway messages from the findings here. We saw that arsenic exposure is inversely associated with lung function, and these results have really been confirmed around the world. And the preliminary findings in this US study show an association between rice consumption and markers of interstitial lung disease. And we see this with increasing levels of percent of high attenuation areas and decreasing FEV1, decreasing FEC. And again, no change in the ratio. So just wrapping up, looking at the future directions, I want to do a little more work with this pilot study data. I really want to examine associations between urinary arsenic and clinical respiratory outcomes and mortality and incidence of obstructive disease, just to rule it out. I also want to examine association between urinary arsenic and markers of immune function. This data is available in Mesa, and it's just waiting for me to get my hands on it. So I'm really excited to dig deeper into this. I also want to work more on this dietary analysis, really trying to look at rice consumption patterns to see if these results hold in further sensitivity testing and to see if rice consumption is actually associated with lower lung function levels. And there are also opportunities to work with this new NHLBI pooled cohort study, which I'd also be interested in getting my hands on, really trying to look at this at a much larger sample size in the US population. And finally, there's a proposal with ONA to measure urinary arsenic in all Mesa participants, and I think I would love to be involved with that and also further this research. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone involved, and if you have any questions, thanks again.
Maybe this is a no-no from an IRB point of view, but looking at the last names could tell you what their ethnic groups are most specifically. Maybe you could have a third party.
But there are no names
Well, someone has the name.
But we know all the ethnic groups. I am not sure I understand.
There's Chinese Americans.
They're all,
Yeah, all of them, I
them
see.
are Chinese Americans. They were specifically recruited as
Oh, that's okay. All right. No, that's, all right.
Not a lot of
So you see an association between rice consumption and statistically significant. What clinically, what is that magnitude of decline in lung function mean? I mean, is it perceptible? Is it just, do we have enough reserves that much of a loss of lung function?
So it depends on what you're starting with and if you can change it over time. I think for FCC, if it's lower than 70%, then that can be a restrictive lung disease. You're going to feel it. Changes here, at least for high attenuation areas, this is sort of comparable to what we see with smoking status. The effect estimates are comparable, but I'm not sure I should be quoted on that. I'd have to look at the paper again.
You're not saying that rice is equivalent to smoking?
No, I'm not saying that.
No. But can you re-explain that?
I'm saying that the associations are similar to smoking, as the direction of association is the same, not the actual magnitude.
So there's a lot of nutritional variation that correlates to arsenic, or correlates to rice, like anemia status, for example, or an iron status is also has a significant respiratory function outcome, right? So it could be fortuitous and not related to the arsenic exposure, just functionally related to the other things that are common in.
This is a great point, and I can definitely, I'm guessing there's a measure of anemia,
Iron.
or iron deficiency. I don't know if they have that in blood, but I can definitely look into it. Yeah.
How did you know that? You're a geochemist.
I didn't
I just looked at it. I looked up some references. Before I was right, to ensure I was getting anything too stupid, but yeah.
Do you think most of the water, like the exposure through water, the variation in that is taken into account when you adjust by location?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the populations here, they're in urban areas, so they're mostly drinking from a public water supply. So we're assuming that they're all drinking from water less than 10 micrograms per liter, so safe water. But we're not sure. We don't know if they're drinking from a well. But we can look at stratified by location. So we think that LA would have higher levels of water arsenic, so maybe we would see a stronger association there. I haven't done it in the longitudinal data set, but yeah.
We've had a talk about also violations of the 10 ppb rules, so it might be worth keeping that in mind.
As I understand that a lot of Asian people would eat more seafood. So do you include that seafood in your analysis, like, or in combination with the rice, or just rice?
We're trying to remove the effects of seafood. I guess, are you asking if we're including seafood in our exposure?
As a source of arsenic exposure.
So the arsenic species that come from seafood are actually non-toxic. So we're trying to remove the influence of the seafood arsenicals from exposure. So that's why we use that calibrated arsenic measure.
Maybe you showed it, I missed it, but have you looked at the baseline lung function across ethnicities? Is it similar across?
Yes. This is using percent predicted. So this is also looking at body size, height. So they should have similar at baseline.
It's a bit of the target question, but I was just wondering, what is the safe level of arsenic in drinking water? In Denmark, they have lowered it to 5, or nobody knows why, I think. In Holland, they have lowered it to 1 microgram per liter. But what is safe and what is anything known about?
I think that's a great question that I don't have a good answer to. Yeah.
I would just say I would never drink water with more than 1 microgram per liter if I have the choice. With the data that we have at the low level arsenic, I think between 1 and 10, the difference is very small.
Depending on where you live, though, you might be very thirsty.
Yeah. If you have the choice of the possibility. Yeah.
But should that mean that, for example, in Europe, that everywhere the drinking water levels would be lower to what? In your opinion?
If possible,
Why would we do it?
economically you can afford
No,
it.
but I know most of what they're trying to talk about the reduction.
As far as I remember, if you take the same risk accepted 1 per 1 million, it has to be 0.17. That's what I've heard from the EU.
Yeah, there's 1 in a million, you know, we want to lower the risk to 1 in a million.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, 40% of Americans will develop cancer in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 will die of cancer. But we're worried about 1 in a million, you know. So
That's what it is.
put it in perspective.
There are so many health endpoints related to arsenic.
Yeah.
We need to remember that the toxicity, arsenic is really one of the most potent toxicants.
If there's nothing more, thank you, Tiffany.
Great.